When I first heard that Aunt Emily was moving in with us, I thought it was a temporary matter. To me, she had always just been my mum's older sister, graceful, a bit strict, and distant. After her divorce, she needed support, and my mum offered for her to stay with us until she could rebuild her life. I didn't expect her arrival to completely change mine. It started with small things. Emily seemed a bit lost but charming in her own way. She wasn't as I remembered her, no longer strict and confident, but a bit vulnerable. Her subtle attempts to find her place in our home and her timid smiles made me feel something strange. I chalked it up to her post-divorce feelings until one day I noticed the way she looked at me. I got home later than usual. The lights were on, and I went to the kitchen for some water. She was standing there holding a mug of tea. The silence in the house emphasized our solitude. "You're late," she said with a soft smile. "Yeah, got held up with friends," I replied, pouring water into a glass. We stood across from each other, quietly sipping our drinks. Usually I would have just gone to my room, but that evening, something kept me there. Her gaze, her voice, everything felt different. "How are you, Emily?" I asked, surprising myself. Her eyes flickered, as if that question meant more than I could have imagined. She took a small sip before replying. "It gets better, but it's still hard," she said softly, lowering her gaze. "I feel like a stranger in my own life." Her words struck me. I didn't know the right thing to say, but I wanted her to know she wasn't alone. I reached for her hand, a spontaneous gesture to show support. She froze. We both stayed silent until I pulled my hand away, as if it had been more than just a comforting gesture. Her gaze met mine again, but this time there was something different. Uncertainty, doubt, and something I hadn't noticed before. "Thank you, Trevor," she said, smiling warmly, and I felt something change within me. That night, I lay in bed trying to understand what had just happened. Her touch, her smile, it all seemed so simple, but I couldn't get it out of my head. All evening I replayed the way her eyes looked at me, the way her voice sounded when she said my name. The next day I decided to forget about it. It was just a moment, nothing more. But things didn't go as planned. Now I noticed her more often. The way she adjusted her hair while reading in the living room, the sound of her laughter when she talked to Mum. She was everywhere, and every gesture, every glance took on new meaning. Emily never showed that she felt anything unusual. On the contrary, she seemed calm and composed, but that only made things more confusing. Sometimes I caught her gaze lingering a bit too long, but she'd quickly look away as if nothing had happened. One evening, I chose to stay home instead of meeting friends. We both ended up on the couch in front of the TV, watching some old movie. I pretended to watch, but kept stealing glances at her. She noticed and smiled, but didn't say anything. That night I couldn't sleep again. I tried to understand what was happening to me. After all, she was just my aunt, nothing more. But her smile, her gaze, everything was different. I began to fear that I could no longer control my thoughts. Emily became a mystery I couldn't solve, and the more I tried to push these thoughts away, the stronger they returned. This was the beginning of something that would forever change our lives. The house was empty. Mum had gone to Wisconsin for the weekend to meet her friends, and it was just Emily and me. It was one of those lazy days when nothing really happens, but you can feel something in the air. I spent the day studying, preparing for an internship interview, while Emily kept busy tidying up around the house, seemingly trying to distract herself from her own thoughts. In the evening, I heard her voice from the living room. "Trevor, would you like to watch a movie? I need a distraction." I went downstairs. She was curled up on the couch, wearing a soft sweater that made her look unexpectedly cozy. There were mugs of cocoa on the coffee table, along with a bag of popcorn. It was too homey to refuse. "Of course," I said, trying not to show how nervous I was. We picked an old movie, a romantic musical from the 60s. The music and dancing filled the room with warmth, but my thoughts kept drifting to the person sitting beside me. Emily seemed engrossed in the film, but I noticed her occasionally casting quick glances at me. Halfway through the movie, she leaned over for some popcorn, and her hand brushed against mine. It was innocent, but in that moment, Something between us shifted. We both froze. She didn't immediately pull her hand away. "Sorry," she said softly, but there was a strange tenderness in her voice. "It's fine," I replied, feeling a jolt run through me. We went back to watching, but the tension was almost tangible. The music, the bright costumes on screen, it all now felt like a meaningless backdrop. All I could feel was her presence, and it seemed she could too. When the movie ended, I reached to turn off the TV. The room fell into a dim light. The soft glow of a table lamp gently illuminated her face. Emily was looking at me as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to. I stayed silent, not knowing what to do. "Thank you for keeping me company," she finally said, her voice quivering slightly. "I'm always happy to," I replied, and then without thinking I added, "You don't have to go through this alone." She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes I feel lost, like I don't know who I am anymore." I didn't know what to say, but the words escaped before I could stop them. "You are stronger than you think." She leaned a little closer, her expression softening even more. "That's sweet of you to say," she said. And then, something happened that I hadn't expected. She leaned in slightly, and her lips brushed my cheek. It was just a gesture of gratitude, but it froze time. We both paused. Her face was so close, I could see every shade in her eyes, hear her catch her breath. My hand, as if on its own, rose to her shoulder and she didn't pull back. Her gaze lingered on my lips. In that moment, the whole world disappeared. I didn't know what I was doing until I was even closer. Our lips met in a short, barely noticeable kiss, but it was real. We pulled away almost immediately, both in shock. "Emily," I began, but I didn't know how to continue. She quickly stood up from the couch, her face tense. "Sorry, this is wrong." She went upstairs, leaving me alone. My heart pounded, as if I had just run a marathon. What was that? Why did it happen? I couldn't tell if it was a mistake or something I genuinely wanted. That night marked the start of a new chapter, though I didn't yet know at what cost. After that night, I couldn't look at Emily the same way. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, but that only made things more difficult. I felt like I was trapped in a room where the air was thick with tension. We avoided each other, even though we were living under the same roof. In the morning, I overheard her talking on the phone with Mum. Emily was laughing, discussing something mundane, but her voice sounded different, warmer. I wanted to see her face, to understand if her laughter was genuine or if she was hiding behind a mask. I went downstairs. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her legs propped up on the chair next to her, holding a mug of coffee. When she saw me, her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Good morning," she said in a neutral tone. "Good morning," I replied, feeling invisible sparks in that short exchange. I decided I needed to do something to ease the tension. Otherwise, I'd go insane. The idea came to me suddenly. "I was thinking of going for a walk to the lake today. Would you like to join me?" Emily raised her eyebrows, surprised, but then she nodded. "Why not?" The lake was a 10-minute walk from the house. It was always quiet there, hidden from prying eyes by the trees. When we reached the water, I felt like it was the right place, a space where we could talk without worrying about anyone hearing us. We found a spot by the shore and sat down on an old wooden bench. The wind rippled the surface of the water and the trees whispered softly around us. "How are you?" I asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. She looked at me, and there was something in her eyes that I couldn't understand. Honestly? Confused. "Me too," I admitted, looking down at the ground. "We shouldn't have," she began, but then trailed off, as if afraid to continue. "I know," I interrupted, "but it happened." Her hands nervously clenched on her knees, and then she slowly turned to face me. "Trevor, I don't want you to think that I used you." Her words stunned me. "You didn't—" "Emily, that's not it." Her gaze softened, though doubt still lingered. We sat side by side and I felt her hand move just a little closer to mine. My thoughts were a mess. Everything inside me screamed that I should pull back, but I couldn't. "I don't know what's happening with us," I said, looking straight into her eyes. She looked at me for a long time, as if trying to decide if she could trust me with this confession. Sometimes it feels wrong, but sometimes it feels like it's the only thing that matters. Those words broke the last barrier between us. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, maybe it was her. But in the next moment, we were closer than ever before. It was one of those rare moments when the whole world seems to stop. Our lips met. There was no hurry, no panic, just a quiet, careful closeness. When we pulled apart, I saw something on her face I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. "We have to stop," she whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could. "If that's what you want." She turned away, as if to hide her emotions, and stood up. "We should head back," she said, her voice firmer. We walked back in silence. The wind played with her hair, and I tried to piece together what had just happened. It was a moment I would never forget, but now it felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and everything would collapse. The days following our walk to the lake dragged on painfully slowly. I couldn't get that moment out of my head. When our lips met, the heat that surged through me. Emily kept her distance, but I noticed her gaze lingering on me a bit longer than it should. It was like a silent war between desire and reason, and we were both losing. One evening after I got home from practice, Mum was already asleep. The house was quiet, and only the light in the living room was on. Emily was curled up on the couch with a book in her hands. When I entered, she looked up, and I saw something in her eyes that immediately caught my attention. Exhaustion, mixed with something else, something deeper. "You're late," she said, closing the book. "Coach held me back," I replied, tossing my sports bag to the floor. We both knew this conversation wasn't really about that. I walked closer but didn't sit down. "How are you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm, though everything inside me was on fire. "Fine," she replied, but her voice trembled. I sighed and sat down on the edge of a chair across from her. We sat in silence, as if someone invisible were watching us, listening to every word. Finally, she broke the silence. "Trevor, we need to talk." Her words made me tense up. I sensed that her voice sounded like a warning. "I'm listening," I replied shortly, trying not to betray my anxiety. She placed her book on the table and looked at me. "I don't want you to think that I don't appreciate you, but this can't continue." Her words, though softly spoken, hit harder than I expected. "Why?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "You know why," she said quietly. "This is wrong. We can't just ignore the consequences." I clenched my hands, trying to stay composed. "It may be wrong, but that doesn't mean it isn't important, Emily." She looked away as if my words hurt her. "You're so young. You have your whole life ahead of you. And I interrupted her, unable to hold back. "That doesn't matter. What I feel matters." Her gaze met mine, and I saw a conflict in her eyes. She wanted to push me away, but something held her back. "Trevor, this isn't just about us," she finally said. "It's about your mother. It's about family." Those words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I knew she was right, but it felt like backing down would be a betrayal of something real. She stood up without looking at me. "We need to stop before it gets worse." Those words sounded like the end. I felt something inside me break. "Fine," I said quietly, "if that's what you want." She paused for a moment, as if she'd expected a different reaction, but said nothing. Then she went upstairs, leaving me alone. Weeks passed. We avoided each other, speaking only when necessary. A tense silence filled the house. Mum didn't notice anything, but I felt like this game on the edge couldn't go on forever. One day as I came home, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Mum and Emily were talking louder than usual. "I don't understand why you decided to leave so suddenly," Mum said, her voice filled with concern. "I just need some time for myself," Emily replied. I stopped in the hallway, unable to enter. My heart started beating faster. She was planning to leave. This was her way of making things right. The next day, her suitcase was by the door. We were alone while Mum was out at the store. She looked at me, and I saw that her eyes were slightly damp. "It's for the best," she said. as if convincing herself more than me. I nodded, even though everything inside me was screaming against it. "Do you think you'll find what you're looking for?" She smiled, but there was so much sadness in her expression that it hurt me. "I hope so." We both knew this was goodbye. I wanted to say something that might make her stay, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there and watched her leave. Emily left, leaving behind an emptiness that I couldn't fill for a long time. I couldn't tell Mum what had happened. Soon after, I found an internship, then moved to another city. Emily and I didn't stay in touch, but sometimes I thought of her, imagining her life somewhere out there, in a different place. It was a story that was never supposed to happen, but I knew I would never forget her.